For 8 years, I've watched my brother Derek smirk every time I mentioned real estate. 8 years of, Tori, maybe focus on paying your own rent first, and patronizing lectures about financial responsibility. 8 years of him offering to co-sign loans while I secretly owned half the neighborhood he calls home. What he doesn't know is that his precious Cherry Creek mansion, I'm his landlord's silent partner. And tomorrow, when his realtor calls me about the property acquisition he's been bragging about, he'll learn that his struggling little sister just became his biggest business rival. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Victoria Blake, but everyone calls me Tori. If you met my family, you'd wonder how we ended up so different. Derek's the golden child. MBA from Wharton, corner office downtown, the kind of guy who wears designer suits to grocery stores. I'm the one who shops at thrift stores and drives a 15-year-old Honda Civic that sounds like it's gargling gravel. At least, that's what they think. The truth is, I choose to live modestly. There's power in being underestimated, freedom in being invisible. When people think you're barely scraping by, they don't ask uncomfortable questions about how you spend your time or where your money comes from. They just assume you don't have any. Derek learned this the hard way last Sunday during our monthly family dinner at Mom's house in Highlands Ranch. We were sitting around her dining table, the same one where he'd announced his Harvard acceptance 20 years ago, where he'd revealed his engagement to Amber, where he'd shared news of every promotion and achievement that had built his reputation as the family success story. "So, Tori," Derek said, cutting into his prime rib with the precise movements of someone who'd never doubted his place in the world. "Mom mentioned you're looking at houses. That's ambitious." The way he said ambitious made it sound like I'd announced plans to colonize Mars. Amber, his wife, tried to hide her smile behind her wine glass, but I caught the eye roll she thought I wouldn't see. "I am looking," I confirmed, taking a bite of my salad. "Found a few interesting properties, actually." Derek's laugh was the kind that cuts, sharp, dismissive, designed to remind everyone in the room of the natural order of things. "Tori, honey, have you looked at housing prices lately? Even the dumps in Capitol Hill are going for $500,000. Maybe you should focus on saving for a decent apartment first." Mom shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She hated when Derek got like this, but she'd never quite figured out how to stop him. 28 years of practice had taught her that intervening usually made things worse. "I've done my research," I said calmly. "I know what I can afford." "Do you, though?" Derek leaned back in his chair, warming to his favorite topic, my apparent financial incompetence. "Because last I checked, you were working part-time at that little nonprofit and living in a studio apartment that probably costs more than it's worth. I mean, I'm happy to help you understand the numbers if you want. Maybe we could look at a budget together, figure out a realistic timeline for our home ownership, like maybe in 10 years if you really commit to saving." Amber nodded along like Derek was delivering profound wisdom instead of condescending nonsense. "Derek could help you understand the mortgage process too," she added helpfully. "It's so much more complicated than people realize." I wanted to tell them that I understood the mortgage process better than most real estate agents, that I'd closed on 17 properties in the past 3 years alone, that my little nonprofit job was actually a consulting cover for the property management company I ran through a network of LLCs and shell corporations that would make their heads spin. Instead, I just smiled. "That's really generous of you both." The conversation moved on to safer topics: Tyler's soccer season, Amber's book club, Derek's latest client acquisition, but I could feel him watching me throughout dinner, probably calculating how long his delusional little sister would realize that she was living in a fantasy. If only he knew that the fantasy was his. Derek's house in Cherry Creek was everything he'd wanted it to be, a testament to his success rendered in stone and steel. The kind of place that photographed well for his LinkedIn updates and impressed his clients. What he didn't know was that I'd been tracking the property for 2 years before he bought it, watching as the previous owner struggled with mounting debt and a messy divorce. When the owner finally decided to sell, I'd connected him with a private buyer who could close quickly and quietly. A buyer who happened to be one of my shell companies. Derek thought he was purchasing directly from the distressed seller. In reality, he was renting to own from me, though the paperwork was buried so deep in corporate structures that even his attorney hadn't caught it. The monthly payments he thought were going toward his mortgage, they were actually lease payments that I was collecting through a web of intermediaries. In 5 years, when the purchase option in his contract expired, he'd discover that he'd been living in my property all along. But that revelation was still years away. Tomorrow's shock would be different and closer to home. My phone buzzed with a text from Michael Torres, my property manager. The morning team had finished the walkthrough of the Westwood complex. Everything looked good for the closing on Friday. Did I want to review the final numbers? I typed back quickly. Send them over. Also, has Wash confirmed the Cherry Creek meetings for this week? Tuesday and Thursday. She seemed excited about the potential partnership. Jennifer Walsh was Derek's realtor, had been for 3 years. She was also about to become my newest business partner in a deal that would reshape Denver's luxury housing market. The irony was almost too perfect. Derek had been bragging about this potential investment opportunity for months, some kind of exclusive development deal that would set him up for life. He dropped hints about inside information, about being positioned for something big, about finally making the kind of money that would put him in a different league entirely. What he didn't know was that the inside information was actually coming from me. Walsh had been feeding him carefully curated details about a property acquisition that I'd been orchestrating from the beginning. He thought he was getting access to a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. In reality, he was walking into a situation where his biggest competition would be his own sister, the one he'd been lecturing about financial responsibility for nearly a decade. The beautiful thing about being underestimated is that people stop seeing you as a threat. They make assumptions about your capabilities, your resources, your ambitions. They treat you like a minor character in their own success story, never realizing that you might be writing a completely different narrative. Derek had spent years positioning himself as the family's real estate expert. He loved talking about market trends, investment strategies, the art of the deal. He'd never asked my opinion on any of it, never considered that I might have insights worth hearing. Tomorrow, when Walsh called him about the Westwood development, he'd learned that his struggling little sister had just outbid him by $20 million. And that was just the beginning. I looked around my modest studio apartment, the carefully constructed stage set that had been hiding my real life for 8 years. The secondhand furniture I'd chosen specifically because it looked like someone struggling to make ends meet. The single bed, the tiny kitchenette, the stack of bills prominently displayed on the counter that were actually paid months in advance. It was all about to change. The performance was almost over, and I was ready to show Derek exactly who I really was. The question wasn't whether I was prepared for that revelation. The question was whether he was ready to discover that his family's biggest failure had been quietly building an empire while he played dress-up in his corporate costume. Some victories are worth waiting for, and I'd been waiting for this one my entire adult life. Growing up in the Blake household was like living in a perpetual performance review where I never quite made the cut. Derek was 4 years older, which might as well have been 40 from the way our parents treated the age gap. He was the prototype, the first draft that came out perfect, while I was the experimental sequel that nobody quite knew what to do with. Our father, Kenneth, was a traditional man who believed in clear hierarchies and measurable success. Derek delivered both in abundance. Valedictorian, debate team captain, early admission to Harvard. Every achievement was another brick in the monument our parents built to their firstborn son. I was the footnote in Derek's story, the "and also" that parents mention when people ask about their children. Derek's doing wonderfully at Harvard, Mom would say at neighborhood gatherings, and Tori's very creative. Creative, the word they used when they couldn't think of anything else to say. It wasn't entirely wrong. I did have an artistic streak,
But the way they said it made it sound like a consolation prize, like creativity was what you got when you couldn't manage actual success. The pattern established itself early. Derek would come home with a report card full of A's, and Dad would take him out for celebratory dinners at expensive restaurants. I'd bring home A's mixed with B's, and Mom would pat my head and tell me I was doing my best. The message was clear. Derek's achievements mattered. Mine were just participation trophies in the game of family expectations. It wasn't malicious exactly. Our parents loved me, I knew that. But love and respect are different things, and respect was reserved for the child who fit their definition of success. Derek understood this instinctively. He learned early that attention was finite, and the best way to keep it was to make sure nobody else deserved it. Tori's grades are pretty good this semester, Mom said one evening when I was 16, apparently trying to include me in a conversation about Derek's latest academic triumph. Pretty good, Derek repeated thoughtfully, like he was considering the phrase from multiple angles. That's great, Tori. I mean, not everyone can be naturally gifted at academics. Some people have to work really hard just to be average. The comment landed like a paper cut, small enough that calling it out would seem petty, sharp enough to draw blood. Derek had perfected this technique over the years, the ability to diminish someone while maintaining plausible deniability. I learned to become invisible rather than compete. It was easier to disappear into books and art projects than constantly measuring myself against someone who'd already claimed the role of family achiever. While Derek commanded the dinner table with stories about his latest accomplishments, I perfected the art of strategic silence. But invisibility has its advantages. When people stop paying attention to you, they stop monitoring what you're doing. They make assumptions about your capabilities and then stop checking whether those assumptions are accurate. Derek was so busy being the star of the family show that he never noticed I'd stopped watching from the audience. My real education happened in places Derek never thought to look. While he was networking at fraternity parties, I was reading real estate investment books in the library. While he was building his resume with prestigious internships, I was learning about property law and market analysis from online courses. While he was establishing his identity as the family success story, I was quietly building expertise in areas he'd never considered. The first property I ever bought was a small duplex in Capitol Hill that the previous owner was desperate to unload. I was 22, fresh out of college, and everyone assumed the down payment came from graduation money and student loans. They weren't entirely wrong. I had cobbled together every dollar I could find, including money I'd saved from years of birthday gifts that Derek had long forgotten about. "That's a pretty rough neighborhood," Derek said when I mentioned the purchase at a family dinner. "Are you sure you've thought this through? Property management is more complicated than people realize." "I'll figure it out," I replied, not mentioning that I'd already spent 6 months researching every aspect of rental property management from tenant screening to maintenance scheduling. "I could help you understand the numbers," he offered in the tone of someone doing a favor. "Real estate investment requires a pretty sophisticated understanding of cash flow analysis." I thanked him and let him believe I'd need his guidance. Meanwhile, I was already planning my second acquisition. The duplex cash flowed from day one. The rental income covered the mortgage, insurance, and maintenance, with enough left over to start building a fund for the next purchase. More importantly, it taught me that I had a talent for seeing potential where others saw problems. The property was in a neighborhood on the verge of gentrification, surrounded by coffee shops and art galleries that were drawing young professionals who couldn't afford Cherry Creek but wanted something hipper than the suburbs. Within 2 years, the property value had increased by 40%. Derek, who'd been offering periodic advice about cutting my losses, never asked how the investment was performing. He'd categorized it as one of my creative experiments and moved on to more important concerns. That was Derek's fundamental mistake. He underestimated everyone who didn't fit his definition of serious. In his world, real success looked like corner offices and client presentations, expensive suits and networking events. The idea that someone could build wealth quietly without fanfare or recognition simply didn't compute. By the time he had established himself as a rising star in commercial real estate, I'd already acquired 6 properties across 3 different neighborhoods. The cash flow from the rentals was funding increasingly ambitious purchases, and I was developing relationships with contractors, property managers, and private lenders who appreciated my ability to close deals quickly and quietly. The family still saw me as the creative one, the daughter who'd bought a little investment property and was probably learning expensive lessons about the realities of real estate. They had no idea I was building a portfolio that would soon dwarf Derek's entire net worth. Mom would call periodically to check on my little rental property, asking if I was managing okay with the responsibilities of being a landlord. Derek would offer occasional nuggets of wisdom about market trends, delivered with the patient condescension of someone explaining basic concepts to a beginner. I let them think what they wanted to think. Every assumption they made, every bit of advice they offered, every gentle suggestion that I might be in over my head, it all served my purposes perfectly. While they were focused on managing their image of me, I was building something they couldn't see. The beautiful irony was that Derek's success actually helped camouflage mine. His achievements were so prominent, so carefully curated and publicized, that they cast a shadow large enough for me to operate in complete obscurity. Family gatherings became showcases for his latest deals and acquisitions, while my growing empire remained invisible in the background. By my 28th birthday, I owned 12 properties worth a combined $8 million. Derek was still explaining real estate basics to me at family dinners, still offering to help me understand concepts I'd mastered years earlier. The performance had become second nature. I played the role of the slightly overwhelmed little sister who was grateful for Big Brother's guidance, while privately calculating the cash flow from properties he didn't know existed. Tomorrow, that performance would finally come to an end, and Derek would learn that the family member he'd been underestimating for 3 decades had been quietly building an empire while he was busy at taking credit for his own success.
The call that would change everything came on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing acquisition reports from my property manager. My phone buzzed with Mom's number, and I could already hear the particular tone she used when she wanted to share family news that she thought would interest me. "Tori, honey, you'll never guess what happened," she said, her voice carrying that mix of excitement and concern that mothers perfect over decades of managing family dynamics. "Derek closed on that big development deal he's been working on, the one in Westwood. He's so excited he can barely contain himself." I set down my coffee mug, genuinely curious about which deal she was referring to. Derek had been dropping hints about several potential investments for months, each one described as the opportunity that would change everything for his portfolio. "That's wonderful, Mom. I know he's been working really hard on his investments. He wants to tell you about it himself at dinner this Sunday. You know how proud he is of his business sense. And honestly, Tori, maybe you could learn something from him. Real estate is so complicated, and Derek really understands the market." There it was again, the gentle suggestion that I could benefit from Derek's expertise, the assumption that his success was built on knowledge I couldn't possibly possess. If only she knew that the Westwood deal she was talking about was probably one of 3 properties I'd been tracking for the past 6 months. "I'd love to hear about it," I said, which was absolutely true, though not for the reasons she imagined. Sunday dinner at Mom's house had taken on a ritual quality over the years. Derek would arrive precisely on time, usually with some business story that dominated the conversation. Amber would play the supportive wife, asking just enough questions to keep him talking. Tyler would alternate between sullen teenage silence and showing off whatever video game achievement he unlocked that week. And I would sit in my designated role as the audience member who appreciated getting a glimpse into the sophisticated world of real estate investment. This particular Sunday, Derek was practically vibrating with excitement. He'd worn his most expensive suit to a family dinner, which was usually a sign that he had news he considered significant.
Amber kept smiling at him with the expression of someone who'd already heard the story multiple times, but was prepared to act surprised for the benefit of the audience. So, Derek said, settling into his chair, with the satisfaction of someone about to deliver a performance he'd been rehearsing, I've got some pretty exciting news to share. Mom leaned forward expectantly. Tyler looked up from his phone with the minimal interest required to avoid parental lectures about family time. I arranged my face into an expression of polite curiosity. Remember that development opportunity I mentioned a few months ago, the Westwood project? Well, it's official. I'm now the primary investor in what's going to be the most exclusive residential complex in Denver. The pride in his voice was unmistakable. This wasn't just another investment for Derek. This was his chance to prove that he belonged in the same league as the major real estate developers he'd been trying to impress for years. "That's incredible, Derek," Mom said, reaching over to squeeze his hand. "Tell us everything." Derek was only too happy to oblige. For the next 20 minutes, he explained the project in excruciating detail. Luxury condominiums targeting high-net-worth individuals, premium finishes and amenities, a location that was perfectly positioned to capitalize on Denver's growing tech sector, expected returns that would dwarf anything he'd achieved in his previous investments. The best part, he said, warming to his favorite subject, is that I got in on the ground floor. Jennifer Walsh, that's my realtor, she brought me this opportunity before it went to market, said she thought of me immediately because she knew I'd understand the potential. Amber nodded along like she was hearing this information for the first time. Derek has such a good eye for these opportunities. He can see potential where other people just see risk. It's all about understanding market dynamics, Derek explained, looking directly at me. Most people focus on the obvious stuff, location, price per square foot, comparable sales. But real success comes from seeing the bigger picture, understanding demographic trends and economic indicators that drive long-term value. I nodded appreciatively, as if he was sharing wisdom I'd never encountered before. In reality, he was describing basic market analysis techniques that I'd been using for years. The demographic trends he was so excited about, I'd identified 18 months ago when I started acquiring properties in anticipation of exactly the kind of development he was now bragging about.
That sounds like a really smart investment, I said, taking a sip of wine to hide my smile. How much are you putting into it? Derek's chest puffed out slightly. $2.7 million. It's the biggest single investment I've ever made. But Jennifer ran all the numbers, and the projected returns are incredible. We're looking at potentially doubling the investment within 3 years. $2.7 million. I did quick mental math, comparing that figure to what I knew about the Westwood project from my own research. If Derek was putting in $2.7 million as the primary investor, that meant the total project value was probably around $15 million, which was exactly what I'd calculated when I'd started planning my own bid. Wow, I said, genuinely impressed by the coincidence. That's a lot of money. You must feel really confident about the market. Confidence comes from knowledge, Derek replied, settling back into his teacher mode. This is what I've been trying to tell you about real estate, Tori. It's not about throwing money at properties and hoping for the best. It's about strategic analysis, understanding market forces, building relationships with the right people. Amber jumped in with supporting commentary about Derek's analytical skills and business instincts. Mom beamed with pride at her successful son. Tyler had returned to his phone, apparently deciding that real estate talk was less interesting than whatever game he was playing. And I sat there, listening to Derek explain investment strategies, while I privately calculated how my competing bid would affect his carefully laid plans. Because here's what Derek didn't know. Jennifer Walsh had been feeding him information about the Westwood project for months, but she'd been sharing details about a different aspect of the development than what he thought. The luxury condominiums he was so excited about, those were phase 2 of a much larger project. Phase 1 was the land acquisition and infrastructure development.
the part that required significantly more capital but offered exponentially higher returns. Derek thought he was investing in a residential development. In reality, he was buying into the construction phase of a project I was planning to control from the ground up. "Jennifer seems like a really good realtor," I said casually. "Has she been working with you long?" 3 years now, Derek replied proudly. "She really understands my investment philosophy. In fact, she specifically reached out to me about this opportunity because she knew I'd appreciate the potential." I nodded thoughtfully, filing away that information for future reference. Jennifer Walsh was about to get very interesting phone calls from both Blake siblings. Only one of us knew it yet. "Well, congratulations," I said, raising my wine glass in a toast. "Here's to successful investments and family achievements." Derek clinked his glass against mine with the satisfaction of someone who just shared exciting news with people who properly appreciated his business acumen. If only he knew that his biggest competition was sitting right across the table, smiling and nodding and secretly planning to outbid him by enough money to make his $2.7 million look like pocket change. The evening wound down with more discussion of Derek's business plans and Mom's gentle questions about my own life that I deflected with vague responses about keeping busy and exploring opportunities. By the time I left, Derek was convinced he'd delivered an inspirational lesson about real estate investment to his little sister. Tomorrow, Jennifer Walsh would be making some very interesting phone calls, and Derek would discover that the family member he'd been lecturing about market dynamics had been playing a completely different game all along.
The betrayal that launched my empire came disguised as a friendship. Her name was Rachel Kim, and she was everything I thought I wanted to be at 23. Confident, connected, and seemingly destined for success in Denver's competitive real estate market. We met during a continuing education seminar on property law. 2 young women in a room full of middle-aged men who treated us like we were playing dress-up in their serious business world. Rachel had the kind of effortless sophistication that I envied. Designer clothes that looked casual but probably cost more than my monthly rent, a business card with an impressive title at a boutique real estate firm, and the kind of confidence that comes from never having to prove yourself to skeptical family members. She approached me after the seminar with a proposition that seemed too good to be true. "You have a really interesting perspective on market analysis," she said, her smile warm and genuine. "I've been looking for someone to partner with on a project, someone smart who isn't afraid of taking calculated risks." The project was a small apartment complex in an emerging neighborhood, exactly the kind of opportunity I'd been studying but couldn't afford to pursue alone. Rachel had the connections and the down payment. I had the analytical skills and the time to manage the renovation process that would transform a struggling apartment building into something that could command premium rents. We worked together like we'd been partners for years. I handled the market research, identified properties with the highest potential for appreciation, and managed the renovation process that would transform a struggling apartment building into something that could command premium rents. Rachel seemed impressed by my work, constantly praising my attention to detail and my ability to see potential where others saw problems. "You have a gift for this," she would say after reviewing my latest market report. "Most people just look at numbers, but you understand how all the pieces fit together." I threw myself into the project with the kind of desperate energy that comes from finally finding something you're genuinely good at. While Derek was climbing the corporate ladder at his firm, I was learning the real estate business from the ground up, negotiating with contractors, researching zoning regulations, and building relationships with the kinds of people who actually made things happen in Denver's property market. The renovation took 8 months. We gutted outdated apartments and rebuilt them with modern finishes that would appeal to the demographic we were targeting. I managed every aspect of the construction process, from selecting cost-effective materials to coordinating inspections to ensuring that every detail met the standards I'd established for the project.
The results exceeded even my optimistic projections. We attracted tenants immediately at rents that were 20% higher than my initial estimates. The building's value had increased by nearly 40%, creating instant equity that validated every hour I'd spent on market analysis and project management. That's when Rachel disappeared. Not dramatically, not with an argument or explanation or even a proper conversation about dissolving our partnership. She just stopped returning my calls, stopped responding to emails about the project we'd built together, stopped acknowledging that I'd been anything more than a temporary consultant on her investment.
When I finally tracked down what had happened, the truth was devastating in its simplicity. Rachel had restructured the ownership of the property without my knowledge, using legal technicalities buried in our original partnership agreement to claim sole ownership of everything we'd built together. The market analysis that had identified the opportunity, the renovation strategy that had maximized its value, the project management that had brought it all to fruition, all of it was now credited exclusively to her vision and expertise. I spent 3 months fighting the theft through legal channels, burning through my savings on attorneys who explained that real estate partnerships were complicated things, and that proving intellectual contribution was nearly impossible when the other party controlled all of the official documentation. Rachel had the resources to hire better lawyers, and she used them to construct a narrative that painted me as a junior partner who'd been grateful for the learning opportunity. The settlement I eventually accepted was humiliating, a small cash payment that barely covered my legal fees, and a non-disclosure agreement that prevented me from discussing the details of our partnership. Rachel kept the building, the profits, and the reputation as an innovative young investor who could see potential where others saw risk. But she also gave me something she never intended, the motivation to build something she could never touch. The settlement money became my seed capital. Instead of looking for another partnership, I decided to build my real estate empire alone, using the expertise I'd developed and the lessons I'd learned about trust and legal protection. If people were going to steal credit for my work, they'd have to find it first. I started small, a single-family rental property in Capitol Hill that I bought under my own name, renovated myself, and managed through a property management company that existed only on paper. The cash flow was modest, but it was mine completely. More importantly, it was the foundation for something larger. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Within 2 years, I'd developed a system for acquiring properties through shell companies and limited liability corporations that made it nearly impossible for anyone to connect my modest lifestyle with my growing portfolio. Each property was owned by a different entity, managed by a different company, and financed through relationships I'd built with private lenders who valued discretion over publicity. The beautiful irony was that Rachel's betrayal had taught me exactly what I needed to know about protecting my assets and my reputation. While Rachel continued building her public profile as a rising star in Denver real estate, I was quietly assembling an empire that dwarfed anything she'd accomplished. By the time Derek was explaining basic market concepts to me at family dinners, I owned 12 properties worth over $8 million. The woman who'd stolen my first success had no idea that she'd actually created her biggest competition, someone who understood the market as well as she did, but who operated completely outside the traditional networks where reputations were built and stolen. Rachel still didn't know who was behind the series of strategic acquisitions that had slowly undermined her position in the Highland neighborhood. She had no idea that her former junior partner was now the largest private landlord in the area she taught me to analyze. That knowledge would remain my secret, just like everything else I'd built from the ashes of her betrayal. Some victories are best savored in silence, especially when your enemies don't know they've already lost.
The art of invisible wealth requires a level of strategic thinking that most people never develop. It's not enough to simply make money. You have to make money in ways that don't create obvious patterns, don't generate public records that curious family members might stumble across, and don't trigger the kind of lifestyle inflation that makes people ask uncomfortable questions about your income sources. I became a master of this art by necessity, not choice. My first lesson in financial invisibility came from studying Rachel's mistake. She'd built her success on visibility. Networking events, industry publications, social media posts about her latest acquisitions. Every victory was documented, every deal was publicized, every success became part of a personal brand that was both her greatest asset and her most significant vulnerability. I chose the opposite approach. My empire would be built in the shadows, using legal structures so complex that even experienced attorneys would need weeks to untangle the ownership chains. Each property was owned by a different limited liability company, each LLC was managed by a different shell corporation, and each shell corporation was owned by trusts and holding companies that created layers of legal protection between my personal identity and my business assets. The Highland neighborhood became my testing ground for this approach. After watching Rachel claim credit for the renovation strategy I'd developed, I decided to quietly acquire everything else in the area that matched my original analysis. If she wanted to be the visible face of Highland's transformation, I'd be the invisible hand controlling it. My first acquisition was a small duplex, 3 blocks from the building Rachel had stolen. The property was owned by an elderly woman who'd inherited it from her parents and was struggling with the maintenance costs and tenant management responsibilities. I approached her through Michael Torres, a property manager I'd hired specifically to serve as the public face of my transactions. Michael was perfect for the role, experienced, professional, and completely uninterested in asking questions about the funding sources for my purchases. He understood that some investors preferred to maintain privacy, and he was skilled at structuring deals that kept his clients' names out of public records. Mrs. Patterson, he told the elderly owner, I represent a private investment group that specializes in preserving neighborhood character while improving housing quality. We're prepared to offer you 15% above market value for a quick, all-cash closing. The offer was generous enough to eliminate any motivation for negotiation or delay. Mrs. Patterson accepted immediately, grateful to transfer the property management headaches to someone else while receiving more money than she'd expected. The closing happened through Riverside Holdings LLC, a company that existed only on paper and had no obvious connection to Victoria Blake. This became my standard operating procedure. Identify undervalued properties in neighborhoods I'd analyzed for growth potential, approach owners through intermediaries with offers they couldn't refuse, and complete transactions through shell companies that maintained my anonymity. Each acquisition was small enough to avoid attention, but collectively they gave me significant influence over entire areas. The Highland neighborhood was particularly suited to this strategy because it was experiencing exactly the kind of gradual gentrification I'd predicted. Young professionals were discovering that they could get more space and character for their money than in the established upscale areas where Derek preferred to invest. Coffee shops and art galleries were opening, property values were climbing steadily, and rental demand was increasing faster than new construction could accommodate. Within 3 years, I owned 7 properties in Highland through 6 different shell companies. Rachel's building, which she continued to tout as evidence of her market insight, was surrounded by rental properties that I controlled, but she didn't know existed. Every time she collected rent from her tenants, she was contributing to the neighborhood improvement that was driving up the value of my surrounding investments. The cash flow from Highland funded my expansion into other emerging neighborhoods. Capitol Hill, where I'd bought my first solo property, became the foundation for a network of rental houses that catered to the creative professionals who couldn't afford downtown but wanted urban amenities. Berkeley, which was just beginning to benefit from the overflow demand from more expensive areas, offered opportunities for small apartment buildings that I could renovate and reposition for higher income tenants. Each neighborhood required its own analysis, its own strategy, and its own network of shell companies to maintain operational security. I developed relationships with contractors who were comfortable working for clients they never met directly, with property managers who understood that discretion was more valuable than publicity, and with private lenders who provided financing without requiring the kind of personal financial disclosure that traditional banks demanded. The financing relationships were particularly crucial to my expansion strategy. Traditional mortgages would have created public records that connected my name to my properties, and they would have required income documentation that would have been difficult to explain to family members who thought I was barely scraping by. Private lenders offered an alternative that was more expensive, but far more flexible. I worked primarily with two different funding sources. The first was a network of local investors who had excess cash but lacked the time or expertise to find good real estate opportunities. They were happy to lend at higher interest rates in exchange for the convenience of passive investment and the security of real estate collateral. The second was a more sophisticated arrangement with a family office that managed wealth for several high net worth individuals. They understood the value of privacy and were willing to structure loans through complex legal entities that maintained my anonymity while giving them the security and returns they required. These relationships allowed me to scale my acquisitions faster than would have been possible through traditional financing. Instead of buying one property per year, I could acquire 3 or 4, using the cash flow from existing rentals to service the debt while building equity through appreciation and strategic improvements. The renovation strategy I developed with Rachel became my signature approach, though no one knew it was mine. I focused on improvements that provided the maximum return on investment while requiring minimal ongoing maintenance. Updated kitchens and bathrooms that appealed to the demographics I was targeting, energy-efficient systems that reduced operating costs, and cosmetic improvements that justified higher rents without requiring major structural work. Michael Torres managed most of these projects through his property management company, coordinating with contractors and suppliers who knew him as a professional investor but had no idea about the scope of the portfolio he was actually managing. The work was always high quality but never flashy, designed to attract good tenants without calling attention to the ownership structure behind the improvements. By my 30th birthday, I owned 18 properties across 5 different neighborhoods with a combined value approaching $15 million. The rental income was generating enough cash flow to fund my living expenses twice over, but I continued living in my modest studio apartment and driving my aging Honda Civic. The performance had become second nature. Derek continued offering advice about real estate investing, while I privately managed a portfolio that was larger than his entire net worth. Family members continued to worry about my financial stability while I collected rent checks from dozens of tenants across the city. The Westwood project that Derek was so excited about represented the next phase of my expansion strategy. Instead of acquiring individual properties, I was ready to start controlling entire developments. And Derek's investment was about to provide the perfect cover for my most ambitious acquisition yet. The months leading up to Derek's Westwood announcement had been particularly difficult in terms of family dynamics. As my portfolio grew larger and more sophisticated, maintaining the facade of financial struggle required increasingly creative explanations for why I wasn't taking advantage of the opportunities my family kept suggesting. The breaking point came during Tyler's high school graduation party in May. Derek had rented a private room at the Denver Country Club, the kind of venue that was designed to impress clients and reinforce social hierarchies. The guest list included business associates, family friends, and neighbors from Cherry Creek who formed Derek's professional and social network. I arrived in my usual modest outfit, a simple dress from Target and flats that were comfortable enough for standing around making small talk with people who measured worth by clothing labels and job titles. The contrast between my appearance and the designer-clad crowd was immediately obvious, and I could see the familiar expression of gentle embarrassment cross Mom's face as she introduced me to Derek's colleagues. "This is my daughter, Tori," she would say, her voice carrying just a hint of apology. "She's very creative and independent." Creative and independent? Code words that meant she was proud of me but wasn't quite sure how to explain what I did for a living to people who understood success in more conventional terms. Derek, meanwhile, was in his element, He worked the room like a politician, sharing stories about his latest deals and accepting congratulations on Tyler's academic achievements with the easy confidence of someone who'd never doubted his place in the social order. When he spotted me near the appetizer table, he made his way over with the expression of someone who'd just remembered an obligation. "Tori, I'm glad you're here," he said, steering me toward a group of his business associates. "I want you to meet some people. This is my sister Tori. She's gotten interested in real estate lately." The introduction was delivered with just enough condescension to establish that my interest in real estate was amateur enthusiasm rather than professional expertise. The men in the group, they were all men, I noticed, smiled politely and asked the kinds of questions you ask when you're being introduced to someone's hobby. "Real estate is such a great investment strategy," one of them said. "Are you looking at residential or commercial properties?" "Mostly residential, small properties, nothing too exciting." "Smart to start small," another chimed in. "Derek always says real estate is all about understanding market fundamentals before you scale up." Derek nodded approvingly, pleased that his business wisdom was being quoted. "Tori's learning a lot about the basics. She bought a little duplex in Capitol Hill a few years ago. Good startup property for understanding landlord responsibilities." The dismissal was casual but complete. In one sentence, Derek had established that my real estate experience consisted of a single starter property and that my role in the conversation was to absorb wisdom from more experienced investors. The men in the group, they were all men, I noticed, smiled politely and asked the kinds of questions you ask when you're being introduced to someone's hobby. "Real estate is such a great investment strategy," one of them said. "Are you looking at residential or commercial properties?" "Mostly residential, small properties, nothing too exciting." "Smart to start small," another chimed in. "Derek always says real estate is all about understanding market fundamentals before you scale up." Derek nodded approvingly, pleased that his business wisdom was being quoted. "Tori's learning a lot about the basics. She bought a little duplex in Capitol Hill a few years ago. Good starter property for understanding landlord responsibilities." The dismissal was casual but complete. In one sentence, Derek had established that my real estate experience consisted of a single starter property and that my role in the conversation was to absorb wisdom from more experienced investors. The men in the group immediately shifted their attention back to Derek, ready to discuss serious business with someone who actually understood the market. I excused myself and found a quiet corner where I could check messages from Michael Torres. 3 more properties had come on the market that week, all in neighborhoods where I'd been waiting for the right opportunities. The potential acquisitions would add another $2.3 million to my portfolio, bringing my total holdings to over $17 million. While Derek entertained his colleagues with stories about his sophisticated investment strategies, I was privately reviewing deals that dwarfed anything he'd ever accomplished. The irony became even more pronounced during the formal dinner portion of the evening. Derek stood up to give a toast about Tyler's achievements and his pride in raising a son who understood the value of hard work and strategic thinking. The speech was heartfelt and genuinely moving, but it was also a masterclass in subtle self-promotion disguised as paternal pride. "Tyler's learned that success isn't about luck or shortcuts," he said, looking around the room at an audience that included several potential clients. "It's about developing expertise, building relationships, and making smart decisions based on knowledge and experience." The applause was enthusiastic, and I could see several business cards being exchanged as people approached Derek to continue conversations about his investment philosophy. Amber was collecting compliments on the party planning and her son's academic achievements, basking in the reflected glory of her successful family. I sat at the family table, smiling and nodding at appropriate moments while privately calculating the cash flow implications of my latest acquisitions. The rental income from my growing portfolio was now generating more monthly revenue than Derek's salary at his commercial real estate firm. But nobody in the room would have believed that information if I'd shared it. The most painful moment came when one of Derek's colleagues approached me directly with what he clearly thought was helpful advice. James Wellington was a partner at a prominent investment firm who'd been impressed by Derek's business acumen and wanted to extend some mentorship to Derek's family. "Tori, Derek tells me you've dipped your toe into real estate investing, he said, settling into the chair next to mine with the confidence of someone accustomed to dispensing wisdom. That's fantastic. Real estate can be a great way to build wealth over time, especially for someone in your situation. My situation. The polite way of acknowledging that I appeared to be struggling financially while trying to learn from more successful family members. I've been fortunate to work with a lot of young investors over the years, Wellington continued, and the key is starting small and being patient. Don't try to get rich quick or compete with people who have more experience in capital. Focus on learning the fundamentals and building slowly. He went on to explain basic concepts about cash flow analysis, market research, and property management, information I'd mastered years earlier and had been applying to a portfolio he couldn't have imagined. The conversation was excruciating in its well-intentioned condescension, but I smiled and thanked him for the advice while internally cataloging the mistakes in his analysis. The evening concluded with Derek accepting congratulations from friends and colleagues who saw him as a rising star in Denver's business community. Several people mentioned potential investment opportunities they'd like to discuss, and I watched him schedule follow-up meetings with the confidence of someone who'd never question his expertise. As I drove home in my aging Honda Civic, I couldn't help but laugh at the disconnect between perception and reality. Derek's professional network saw him as a sophisticated investor worth courting for future deals. In reality, his little sister owned more real estate than anyone at that party, including the host. The next morning, Michael Torres called with news that would make Derek's graduation party seem like a minor warm-up act. Jennifer Walsh wanted to schedule a meeting about the Westwood project. Not just any meeting. She wanted to discuss a partnership opportunity that could change everything about Denver's luxury development market. She seemed particularly interested in our acquisition strategy, Michael reported, said she'd been tracking some of our recent purchases and was impressed with the portfolio we've been building. I smiled as I hung up the phone. Jennifer Walsh was Derek's Realtor, his trusted advisor on investment strategy, his source for the exclusive opportunities that he was so proud of accessing. She was also about to become my newest business partner in a deal that would make Derek's $2.7 million investment look like pocket change. The performance was almost over. In a few days, Derek would discover that his struggling little sister had been building an empire while he was playing dress-up in his corporate costume. Some revelations are worth waiting for, and this one was going to be spectacular.
The meeting with Jennifer Walsh was scheduled for Tuesday morning at her office in Cherry Creek, the same building where Derek had signed the papers for his Westwood investment just 3 weeks earlier. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd be sitting in the same conference room where my brother had celebrated what he thought was the business opportunity of a lifetime, discussing a deal that would make his investment seem like a rounding error. Michael Torres had arranged the meeting under his usual protocol for maintaining my anonymity. As far as Jennifer knew, she was meeting with the representatives of Pinnacle Development Group, a private investment consortium that had been quietly acquiring properties throughout Denver's emerging markets. She had no idea that Pinnacle was one of my shell companies, or that the consortium was actually a single person she'd never met. "She's definitely interested," Michael reported during our prep call Monday evening, said she's been tracking our acquisition pattern and wants to discuss a larger partnership. Apparently, she's got access to some development opportunities that would fit perfectly with our strategy. Our strategy. Even Michael didn't know the full scope of what we were building. He knew me as Sarah Martinez, a private investor who preferred to work through intermediaries. He had no idea that Sarah Martinez was actually Victoria Blake, sister to one of his new business partner's most important clients. The deception had layers within layers, protections within protections. If Derek somehow discovered that his realtor was working with other investors, he'd find a paper trail that led to Sarah Martinez and Pinnacle Development Group. He'd never find a connection to his sister unless he dug deep enough to uncover the trust structures and shell companies that would require forensic accountants to untangle. Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of perfect Colorado weather that made me grateful to live in Denver, regardless of family complications.
I dressed carefully for the meeting, professional enough to be taken seriously, modest enough to maintain my personal brand of invisible success. A simple black suit from Nordstrom Rack, understated jewelry, and the kind of portfolio bag that suggested competence without ostentation. Jennifer Walsh's office was exactly what I'd expected from Derek's descriptions. Glass and steel sophistication designed to impress clients who measured success by appearances. The reception area featured awards and recognition plaques that established her credibility in Denver's competitive real estate market, along with photos of luxury properties that showcased her expertise in high-end transactions. "Miss Martinez?" The receptionist's voice carried the practiced warmth of someone trained to make wealthy clients feel welcomed and appreciated. "Ms. Walsh is ready for you in the main conference room." I followed her down a hallway lined with framed articles about Jennifer's biggest deals, including several that featured Derek's investments in smaller roles. One article from the previous year mentioned his acquisition of a commercial property in Lodo, describing him as an emerging force in Denver's investment community who was building a portfolio of strategic assets. If only they knew that his emerging force of a sister had been building a much larger portfolio while he was getting quoted in trade publications. Jennifer Walsh was exactly as Derek had described her, mid-40s, professionally polished, with the kind of confident handshake that suggested she was comfortable negotiating deals worth millions of dollars. Her office overlooked downtown Denver, and the view alone probably cost more in monthly rent than most people made in a year. "Miss Martinez, it's a pleasure to finally meet you," she said, gesturing toward the conference table where several folders were already arranged. "I have to say, your acquisition strategy has been impressive to watch." "Thank you," I replied, settling into my chair with the same calm confidence I'd learned to project during property negotiations. "We believe in taking a long-term approach to market development." "That's exactly what I wanted to discuss," Jennifer said, opening the first folder to reveal detailed plans for the Westwood project. "I think there's an opportunity for us to work together on something much larger than individual property acquisitions." For the next hour, she laid out the details of what she was calling the most significant development opportunity in Denver's current market. The Westwood project that Derek was so excited about was indeed substantial, a luxury residential complex that would cater to high-net-worth individuals relocating to Colorado's growing tech sector. But Derek's investment was only funding Phase 2 of a much larger development plan. Phase 1 was the land acquisition and infrastructure development that would make the luxury condominiums possible. Phase 2 was the residential construction that Derek was financing. Phase 3 was a commercial component that would create a complete live-work-play environment. The total project value is approximately $45 million, Jennifer explained, her voice carrying the excitement of someone describing a career-defining opportunity. "We have funding commitments for Phases 2 and 3, but we need a strategic partner for the initial land acquisition and infrastructure development." I did quick mental calculations as she spoke. Derek's $2.7 million investment was significant within the context of Phase 2, but it represented only 6% of the total project value. The infrastructure development she was describing would require an investment of $12 to $15 million, money that would control the entire development regardless of who funded the later phases. "What kind of partnership structure are you envisioning?" I asked, maintaining the neutral tone I'd perfected for high-stakes negotiations. Pinnacle would be the lead investor in Phase 1, with full development control and the majority of eventual profits. The other investors would essentially be building on land that you own and infrastructure that you've provided. The beauty of the arrangement was immediately obvious. Derek and the other Phase 2 investors would be putting their money into a project where I controlled the underlying assets. They'd be my tenants, in the most literal sense, building their luxury condominiums on land that I owned through shell companies they'd never be able to identify. "There's one more thing," Jennifer added, her voice dropping slightly as if she was sharing confidential information. "I should mention that I'm already working with another investor on Phase 2. Derek Blake. He's been a client of mine for several years. Very sophisticated investor. He's committed $2.7 million to the residential development. I kept my expression neutral, though internally I was savoring the moment. That sounds like a substantial commitment from Mr. Blake. Oh, Derek's been planning this investment for months, Jennifer said with genuine enthusiasm. He has excellent instincts for identifying opportunities before they become obvious to the broader market. This project will probably establish him as one of Denver's major real estate players. Derek's excellent instincts, his sophisticated investment approach, his status as an emerging major player, all built on a foundation that I was about to own outright. The timeline is aggressive, Jennifer continued. We need to close on the land acquisition within 30 days to maintain our development schedule. Are you prepared to move quickly on an investment of this magnitude? I pretended to consider the question, as if $15 million required careful deliberation rather than a simple transfer between accounts I controlled. Pinnacle is definitely interested. Can you send the complete financial analysis to Michael? We'll need to review the numbers and get back to you within the week. Absolutely, Jennifer said, clearly pleased with my response. I think this partnership could be exactly what Pinnacle needs to establish a major presence in Denver's luxury development market. As I left her office, I couldn't help but smile at the perfect irony of the situation. Jennifer Walsh thought she was introducing Pinnacle Development to Derek Blake's investment opportunity. In reality, she was about to make Derek's sister his secret business partner and landlord. The revelation was only days away now. Soon Derek would discover that his biggest real estate success was actually being controlled by the family member he'd been underestimating for 3 decades. Some truths are worth the wait.
The call came on Thursday morning at exactly 9:47 a.m. I know the precise time because I was sitting in my modest studio apartment reviewing the final wire transfer confirmations for the Westwood land acquisition when my phone rang with Derek's number. The $15 million transaction had closed 2 hours earlier, making me the controlling partner in the development that my brother thought represented his path to real estate stardom. Tori? Derek's voice carried a strain I'd never heard before, like someone trying to process information that didn't fit any existing framework. I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. I set down my coffee mug, genuinely curious about what had prompted this uncharacteristic tone. Derek never asked for honesty, he delivered it, usually in the form of advice I hadn't requested. Of course, I replied. What's going on? Jennifer Walsh just called me. She said there's been a development with the Westwood project, something about a new primary investor who's taken control of the land acquisition and infrastructure development. My heart rate increased slightly, but my voice remained steady. That sounds significant. How does it affect your investment? That's what I'm trying to figure out, Derek continued, his voice carrying the particular frustration of someone accustomed to being in control of situations. Jennifer says the new investor is someone called Pinnacle Development Group, and they've essentially bought the foundation of the entire project. My investment is now dependent on their development timeline and their approval of the residential phase. I made a non-committal sound that could have been sympathy or confusion. Did she explain why they didn't mention this possibility earlier? She said it happened very quickly. Apparently, this Pinnacle group has been tracking the project for months, and they've moved faster than anyone expected. Derek's pacing had intensified. The thing is, Tori, Jennifer seemed to know a lot about this investment group. Like, a lot more than she should if they just appeared out of nowhere. What do you mean? She mentioned that Pinnacle has been building a portfolio of properties throughout Denver, strategic acquisitions in emerging neighborhoods, sophisticated market analysis, the kind of long-term planning that suggests serious expertise. And here's the weird part. She said they've been particularly active in areas like Highland, Capitol Hill, and Berkeley, the same neighborhoods you've mentioned having properties in.
The moment hung between us like a bridge neither of us was ready to cross. I could feel Derek's analytical mind working through possibilities, trying to connect pieces that didn't seem to fit together. "Derek," I said carefully, "what exactly are you asking me?" "I'm asking if you know anything about Pinnacle Development Group, because Jennifer Walsh wants to arrange a meeting between me and their representatives, and something about this whole situation feels off." The irony was perfect. Derek wanted to meet with Pinnacle Development to discuss his investment concerns, not knowing that Pinnacle's primary representative was sitting in a studio apartment wearing pajamas and calculating how much his monthly payments would contribute to my cash flow. "When is this meeting supposed to happen?" "That's the other strange thing," Derek replied. "Jennifer said Pinnacle is very particular about privacy. They preferred to work through intermediaries, and they've requested a conference call rather than an in-person meeting. She's setting it up for tomorrow morning." I closed my eyes, knowing that the performance I'd maintained for 8 years was about to end in the most dramatic way possible. "Derek, before you have that meeting, there's something I need to tell you." "What?" The suspicion in his voice was unmistakable now. "I am Pinnacle Development Group." The silence that followed was so complete, I wondered if the call had dropped. I could hear Derek breathing, but no words came for nearly 30 seconds. "What did you just say?" His voice was barely above a whisper. "I own Pinnacle Development Group," I repeated, my voice gaining strength as I finally spoke the truth I'd been hiding for years. "I am the investor who just acquired control of the Westwood project. Your $2.7 million investment, you're now essentially my tenant."
That's impossible. Derek's response was immediate and decisive. "Tori, you live in a studio apartment. You drive a 15-year-old Honda. You work part-time at a nonprofit. You can't afford rent on some months, let alone $15 million for a development project." "I choose to live in a studio apartment," I corrected. "I choose to drive an old car. I choose to work at a nonprofit because I own enough rental properties to generate more passive income than your salary. And I just chose to invest $15 million because I've been building a real estate empire for 8 years while you've been explaining basic market concepts to me at family dinners." The pacing had stopped. Derek's breathing had become shallow and rapid, like someone processing shock. "Show me," he said finally. "Show you what?" "Proof. Documents. Bank statements. Something that proves you're not having some kind of breakdown." His voice carried the desperate edge of someone clinging to a version of reality that was rapidly dissolving. "Because what you're telling me is impossible. I would know if my sister owned $15 million worth of real estate. Mom would know. Someone would know." I walked to my laptop and pulled up the portfolio management software that tracked my properties in real time. "Derek, I own 23 properties across Denver with a combined value of approximately $18 million. I've been acquiring them through shell companies and limited liability corporations that keep my name out of public records. The rental income generates about $47,000 per month in cash flow." "Stop." Derek's voice cracked slightly. "Just stop talking for a minute." I could hear him sitting down heavily, probably in the leather chair behind his office desk, where he'd conducted so many important business calls. The chair where he'd probably imagined calling to brag about his successful Westwood investment, never knowing that his success was completely dependent on his sister's approval. "Jennifer Walsh has been working with you," he said slowly, like someone piecing together a crime scene. "Your property manager has been coordinating with my realtor. Jennifer doesn't know who I am," I clarified. "She thinks she's working with Sarah Martinez, a representative of Pinnacle Development. But yes, she's been helping me build a portfolio while simultaneously helping you invest in projects that I'm now controlling." Derek made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "How long?" 8 years, I replied, since right after college when I decided that being underestimated was actually an advantage. 8 years, he repeated. 8 years of family dinners where I explained real estate investing to you. 8 years of offering to help you understand market analysis. 8 years of worrying about your financial stability. 8 years of building something you never thought I was capable of." The revelation was complete now.
hanging between us like a detonated bomb. Derek knew that his biggest real estate success was actually controlled by the sister he'd spent 30 decades treating like a financial charity case. He knew that every piece of advice he'd given me, every condescending explanation about market dynamics, every offer of help with my budget, all of it had been delivered to someone who was quietly outperforming him by orders of magnitude. "The meeting tomorrow," Derek said, his voice hollow. "Jennifer said Pinnacle wants to discuss the partnership structure. That would be me wanting to discuss how your investment fits into my development plan." Derek laughed then, a sound that carried no humor whatsoever. My little sister, my struggling, creative, financially irresponsible little sister, just became my business partner and landlord. Among other things, yes. The truth was finally out, and everything was about to change.
The silence on the phone stretched for nearly 2 minutes before Derek spoke again. When he finally did, his voice had changed completely. Gone was the confident older brother who dispensed wisdom to his struggling sibling, replaced by someone trying to rebuild his understanding of reality from the ground up. "I need to see the documents," he said quietly. "All of them. The property records, the portfolio statements, the corporate structures. Everything." "Derek, you don't need to." "Yes, I do." His tone carried a desperate edge. "Because either my sister has been lying to our entire family for 8 years, or I've been living in some kind of alternate reality where I completely failed to notice that she's more successful than I am." I heard him take a shaky breath. "And honestly, Tori, I'm not sure which possibility is worse." The pain in his voice was unexpected. I'd anticipated anger, disbelief, maybe even grudging respect. But Derek sounded broken, like someone discovering that their fundamental understanding of themselves was built on quicksand. "I'll have Michael send you everything, but Derek, you should know that this doesn't change anything about your investment. The Westwood project is still going to be incredibly successful. You'll still make excellent returns." Derek laughed, but it sounded more like a sob. "Returns, Tori. I bragged to everyone at Tyler's graduation party about this deal. I told people I was becoming a major player in Denver real estate. I accepted congratulations for my sophisticated investment strategy. And it turns out I was just, what, comic relief in my little sister's business empire?" Before I could respond, Derek's other line began ringing. "Hold on. That's Jennifer calling. She probably wants to coordinate tomorrow's meeting with Pinnacle Development." Another bitter laugh. "With you." He put me on hold, leaving me alone with the weight of what I'd just done. 8 years of careful construction had just collapsed in a single phone call, and I wasn't entirely sure how I felt about it. Relief, certainly. The performance had been exhausting, but also something like regret for the pain I could hear in Derek's voice. When he came back on the line, his tone had shifted again. "Jennifer wants to move the meeting to this afternoon. Apparently, Pinnacle's representatives have some concerns about the project timeline that need immediate attention." "Derek," I told her yes. I told her I'm very interested in meeting the people who just took control of my investment. I told her I want to understand exactly how sophisticated their operation really is. The challenge in his voice was unmistakable. Derek might be shocked and hurt, but he was also curious about the scope of what I'd built. The same analytical mind that had made him successful in his own real estate ventures was now focused on understanding how his sister had surpassed him so completely. "The meeting is at 3 o'clock, Derek continued. "Jennifer's office, same conference room where I signed my investment papers. She thinks she's introducing Derek Blake to the mysterious Pinnacle Development Group." "And you want me to show up as myself?" "I want you to show up as whoever you really are, because apparently I don't know that person at all." The afternoon meeting was surreal in ways I hadn't anticipated. I arrived at Jennifer's office 15 minutes early, dressed in the same professional attire I'd worn for our previous meeting. But this time, instead of maintaining my Sarah Martinez persona, I was prepared to introduce myself as Victoria Blake, Derek's sister and the controlling partner in his investment.
Jennifer greeted me with the same professional warmth she'd shown before. Miss Martinez, thank you for accommodating the schedule change. Mr. Blake should be here shortly. I almost corrected her about my name, then realized that the revelation would be more dramatic if Derek was present. Instead, I settled into the conference room and waited for my brother to arrive for the most uncomfortable business meeting of both our lives. Derek walked into the room at exactly 3 o'clock, and I watched his face cycle through a series of expressions as he saw me sitting at the conference table. Recognition, confirmation, and something that might have been admiration all flickered across his features before settling into professional composure. Jennifer, I'd like to introduce you to Victoria Blake, my sister.
Jennifer's confusion was immediate and complete. She looked between Derek and me like someone trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. I'm sorry, I don't understand. This is Miss Martinez from Pinnacle Development. No, Derek said, taking a seat across from me with the careful movements of someone trying to maintain dignity in an impossible situation. This is my sister Tori, who has apparently been building a real estate empire while I've been explaining basic investment concepts to her at family dinners. The truth hit Jennifer like a physical blow. Her professional composure cracked, and she stared at me with the expression of someone realizing they'd been unknowingly facilitating a family drama of epic proportions. "Ms. Blake," she said slowly, "are you telling me that you own Pinnacle Development Group?" "Among other companies, yes. I've been working with Michael Torres to build a portfolio of properties throughout Denver. The Westwood land acquisition was just the latest addition." Jennifer sat down heavily in her chair, probably calculating the implications of having Derek Blake's sister as her newest major client, while Derek himself was investing in projects she controlled. "This is," she began, then stopped, apparently unable to find words for the situation. "Complicated," Derek finished. "This is very complicated." For the next hour, we walked through the details of my portfolio with a thoroughness that felt like a deposition. Derek asked pointed questions about acquisition strategies, financing structures, and market analysis with the focused intensity of someone trying to understand how he'd missed something so significant. Jennifer contributed periodic observations about market trends and property values, clearly struggling to reconcile her image of Derek's struggling sister with the evidence of sophisticated real estate investment spread across the conference table. The numbers were undeniable. 23 properties, $18 million in total value, $47,000 in monthly rental income, and a development pipeline that included projects worth another $30 million. Derek reviewed each document with the attention to detail that had made him successful in his own career, asking questions that demonstrated both his expertise and his growing recognition of mine. "The Highland acquisitions," he said, studying a portfolio summary that showed my concentration of properties in that neighborhood. "You bought 7 properties in an area where that woman, what was her name, Rachel Kim, had that building you worked on in college?" "Rachel doesn't know I own most of her neighborhood, but yes, I've been quietly acquiring everything around her original investment." Derek looked up from the documents with something that might have been respect. "That's actually brilliant. Ruthless, but brilliant." "I learned from the best," I replied, meeting his eyes directly. "You taught me that real estate is about understanding market forces and building strategic advantages." The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Derek had been unknowingly providing educational guidance to his primary competition in Denver's real estate market. "So what happens now?" Derek asked, finally. "With Westwood, with our family, with all of this?" I looked at my brother, really looked at him for the first time in years without the filter of our established family roles. He was still the successful businessman, still the golden child, still the person who commanded respect in professional settings. But he was also, I realized, someone who had genuinely cared about my welfare even when his concern was misguided.
Now, I said, we figure out how to be siblings instead of patron and charity case. Derek smiled then, the first genuine expression of humor I'd seen from him all day. That might be the biggest project either of us has ever undertaken. He wasn't wrong about that. 6 months later, I declined Derek's invitation to invest in his next development project, not out of spite or lingering resentment, but because I was finally free to make business decisions based on merit rather than family dynamics. His proposal was solid but unexceptional, and I had better opportunities that aligned with my long-term strategy. The conversation happened over coffee at a small cafe in Capitol Hill, 3 blocks from the duplex where my real estate empire had begun. Derek had suggested the location, probably recognizing the symbolic appropriateness of discussing business in the neighborhood where I'd first outmaneuvered him without his knowledge. "I understand," he said after I explained my decision, and his tone carried none of the condescension that had characterized our conversations for 3 decades. "The returns don't justify the risk, especially when you've got the Westwood expansion moving forward." The Westwood project had exceeded everyone's projections, including mine. Derek's residential phase had sold out before construction was complete, generating enough demand to justify the commercial component I was developing in Phase 3. His $2.7 million investment was on track to return nearly double his money within 2 years. Excellent performance by any measure, even if it was happening on land I owned. "How's Tyler adjusting to see you?" I asked, changing the subject to safer family territory. Derek smiled with genuine parental pride. "He loves it. Engineering program, just like his old man wanted. Though he keeps asking questions about your investment strategies, I think you've inspired him to consider real estate development as a career option." The idea of my nephew following my path instead of Derek's was amusing in ways I couldn't fully articulate. Tyler had been present for years of family gatherings where Derek had positioned himself as the business expert while I played the struggling creative type. Now he was asking his previously successful father for introductions to his mysteriously successful aunt. "I'd be happy to talk with him," I said. "Maybe show him some of the entry-level properties in my portfolio, explain how the numbers work." "I was hoping you'd say that," Derek replied. "Though I have to warn you, he's been reading about real estate investment online. He might know more than I did when I was lecturing you about market fundamentals." The self-deprecating humor was new for Derek, part of the personality adjustment he'd been making since discovering that his expertise was less comprehensive than he had believed. Our relationship had become more honest, more equal, and surprisingly more affectionate than it had been when we were locked into our assigned family roles. Mom had taken the revelation better than either of us expected. After the initial shock of learning that her supposedly struggling daughter was worth more than most of their neighbors, she had settled into a kind of bemused pride that seemed to suit her personality. "I always knew you were special," she'd said during a recent phone call. "I just didn't know you were special in exactly the same way as Derek." The family dynamics had stabilized into something healthier than what we had before. Derek was still successful, still respected for his business acumen, but no longer positioned as the sole source of financial wisdom in the Blake family. I was no longer the charity case who needed guidance and support, but I also wasn't the secret mogul who had to hide her achievements to maintain family harmony. The most significant change was that we could finally have genuine conversations about business and investment strategy. Derek's expertise was real, even if it was more limited than he had originally believed. My success was substantial, even if it had been built through methods he was still learning to understand. "There's something else I wanted to discuss," Derek said, pulling out a folder that looked suspiciously official. "I've been thinking about our partnership structure for Westwood, and I have a proposal." I raised an eyebrow. "What kind of proposal?" "I want to buy out my position and reinvest the proceeds in a joint venture," he said, opening the folder to reveal financial projections and partnership agreements. "Equal partners, shared decision-making, combined expertise. I bring my network and development experience. You bring your acquisition strategy and financial resources." The proposal was unexpected, but not unwelcome. Derek had demonstrated real skill in managing the residential development phase of Westwood, and his professional network included relationships that would be valuable for future projects. More importantly, the partnership would be based on mutual respect rather than the patronizing dynamic that had defined our previous interactions. "What would we focus on?" I asked, genuinely curious about his vision. Mixed-use developments in emerging neighborhoods, Derek replied, his voice carrying the enthusiasm he usually reserved for his most promising opportunities. The kind of projects that require both analytical precision and operational expertise. You identify the opportunities, I manage the development process, we both profit from the results. I reviewed his projections while he waited, noting the thoroughness of his research and the conservatism of his assumptions. The financial modeling was sophisticated, the market analysis was accurate, and the proposed partnership structure was genuinely equitable. One condition, I said finally. No more lectures about basic investment principles. Derek laughed, the sound carrying 8 years of accumulated irony. Deal. Though I reserve the right to ask questions about your shell company structures. I'm still trying to figure out how you managed to buy 7 properties in Highland without Rachel Kim noticing. The business partnership we eventually formed became more successful than either of us had achieved individually. Derek's development expertise combined with my acquisition strategy created opportunities that neither of us could have pursued alone. Within 2 years, Blake & Blake Development had become one of Denver's most respected boutique development firms, known for identifying undervalued neighborhoods and creating projects that enhanced rather than displaced existing communities. The irony wasn't lost on me that the family member I'd spent years hiding from had become my most trusted business partner. Derek brought legitimacy and operational expertise to projects that might have remained forever hidden behind shell companies and intermediaries. I brought capital and analytical precision to developments that might have otherwise relied too heavily on conventional wisdom and established relationships. Our success was built on complementary strengths rather than competitive dynamics, and the results spoke for themselves. The Blake family had produced not one, but 2 successful real estate developers, each operating according to their own principles, but working together when the opportunities justified collaboration. More importantly, we'd learned to see each other clearly for the first time in our adult lives. Derek was genuinely talented, genuinely knowledgeable, and genuinely committed to creating value through real estate development. I was genuinely capable, genuinely innovative, and genuinely successful at building wealth through strategic investment. The performance was finally over. The careful construction of appearances, the management of family expectations, the exhausting maintenance of incompatible identities, all of it had been replaced by something simpler and more sustainable. I could finally be exactly who I was, Victoria Blake. Real estate developer, sister to Derek Blake, daughter to parents who were proud of both their children's achievements, and creator of an empire that no longer needed to hide in the shadows. The woman who'd spent 8 years being underestimated had finally found her way to being properly understood, and it turned out that being seen clearly was even more satisfying than being mysteriously successful. Some revelations are worth the wait, but the best ones lead to relationships that are worth the truth. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.